Okay, I am now sharing my screen. Just somebody let me know if you are having any trouble seeing it. So this is a photo of Fitzgerald Marine Reserve of the Syncline area. And there are really two beaches that you can tide pool at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. One is the main beach, which is where our parking lot is located, and there's really wonderful tide pools there. But there's also the other side of the reserve at Seal Cove Beach, and there's absolutely beautiful tide pools down there. And I actually sometimes prefer to walk from the parking lot and go over to the Seal Cove side because the tide pools just stretch out a little bit further, and you often have the opportunity to see some different species. So let's go ahead and get started. We are going to start by just learning a little bit about what causes tides. And most of you are probably familiar with this, but it's always a good refresher. So you'll see this graphic up top that is explaining what causes these tides. So the moon's gravitational force causes Earth and its oceans to bulge out on the side closest to and farthest from the moon, which I know is a little bit of an odd concept. And these bulges of water are called high tides. So as the Earth rotates, your region of Earth is going to pass through each of these bulges during the course of the day. So when you're in one of those bulges, you have a high tide. So that's why we have two high tides and two low tides during the course of one 24-hour period. Now, a lot of people are familiar with this term called king tides. They're also known as spring tides. They're not called spring tides because of the season spring, but rather because the tides are springing forth. So king tides, this is a picture from the Embarcadero near the piers in San Francisco with the Bay Bridge in the background. So this is what happens during the highest of the high tides. You can see this person walking along without shoes because the water is actually coming up onto the promenade, which does happen approximately twice per month during the highest of the tides. There are approximately 4 tidal zones that we talk about when we teach about tide pools. So you can see this graphic on the left-hand side that's describing the 4 different zones. So the first zone is the splash zone, but that's what you would think of as the beach, what most of us would call the beach. The splash zone is the area that is exposed the most. So it is not often covered by the ocean, except during the highest of tides. And at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve, the highest tide generally goes about 7 feet above mean sea level. So 7 feet above sea level. And then there's the low tide zone, which is zone 4. And that's the one that's out in the ocean here, closer to the ocean. The low tide zone is covered the most by ocean water. And it's not until we get into really low tides that tend to happen about twice per year. Generally in wintertime is the best time to tide pool, but of course it's often rainy in wintertime, so it can be difficult to tide pool. But wintertime is the time when we get the lowest tides, and that's when we can go out further and when we see really incredible animals, some of which we're going to be meeting in the presentation today. So plants and animals live in the different tidal zones based on their ability to adapt to the different features that are happening in each of these zones. So is there a constant flow of water? Is it constantly covered by ocean? Is it being submerged multiple times a day? What's the temperature? Of course, in the low tide zone, you are going to have a more constant temperature than you're going to have up on the beach, where you might be getting inundated multiple times a day by water. What is the wave action like? The wave action in the high tide zone, which are these green dots that you can see adjacent to the beach, you're often getting inundated by waves in that zone. And waves, as you know, if you've spent any time at the ocean, they can be pretty harsh. You really have to be careful with waves. And imagine that you're a tiny little turban snail and you need to survive with these waves pounding on you multiple times a day. How salty is it? So depending on how salty that zone is, you might find less animals if it's more salty in a certain area. And then exposure to light as well. How much sunlight is this area getting? So we like to recommend, if you are going out tide pooling, we recommend going out during the lowest tides. So you can see here, 0 is the mean sea level. And when you have a low tide, that's when you want to go out. If you can get into the negative range, you will be able to go further out into the tide pools and have the potential to see a lot more animals. And that's where we're going to meet some of our animals today. All right. So what we're going to do now is we are going to take a journey through the tide pools. I know it's really hard for a lot of people to get out to the tide pools. They're in a rather inaccessible location. There's not a lot of public transportation that goes out there. And also, being on the tide pools can be pretty hard on some people. They're not accessible to everyone. You have to be very sure-footed and feel comfortable walking on kind of rocky conditions. So what I'm hoping to do is, with this presentation, is kind of take you on a journey and introduce you to some of these animals if you are not able to get out to the tide pools yourself. So we are going to go through each of the zones, each of the 4 zones, and I'm going to show you the animals that are most found in those zones. A lot of these animals can be found in all 4 of the zones, but we're going to meet them in the zones that they are most likely to be found in. Okay. So the first zone we are starting in is the splash zone, what I like to call the beach area. It's the beach and the rocks along the edge. So this area is definitely it's exposed the most amount of time. It's underwater for the least amount of time because it's much higher up. So for that reason, very few species live here because the temperatures range so much. They can vary 30 degrees in one day, depending on when there's waves coming up onto the beach and when they're just completely and totally exposed during the day. Moisture can range. You might be in complete desiccation for days, or you might be submerged for a few hours. So these animals that live in this zone have to be very hardy. They really have to adapt to very variable conditions. So the 2 species that we find most frequently in the splash zone are limpets and acorn barnacles. And these are the species that a lot of people are very familiar with, but we're going to talk a little bit about adaptations that they have for living in this zone. So limpets are these cone-shaped mollusks. And what I find really unique about them is they are capable of creating a home scar. And I don't have a great picture of it, but what they do is they will actually, in the rocks, they will create a little depression that just fits their shell. So nothing else can fit there, but they fit perfectly in that depression. And oftentimes when they go out to feed, they will come right back and live in that same home scar for days. And I find that really, really a unique adaptation. So limpets, you look at this and you go, is that even alive? And what exactly is it doing? When it is covered by water, it will actually pick itself up on a foot and it will move along searching for food. And then when it knows that it's not going to be covered by water anymore, it will go back to that home scar. And I think that's really a unique adaptation that they have. And they are most likely feeding on algae. That's their number 1 food that they do feed on. Acorn barnacles, these over here, a lot of people are familiar with barnacles. They attach to boats, they attach to whales. You can see them in many, many different places. But this is an up-close view that lets you see a little bit more what they look like up close and personal. Acorn barnacles are a type of crustacean, so they are related to crabs. Baby barnacles, they float in the ocean almost as plankton. So a lot of animals do like to eat them. And when this baby barnacle, as it's floating around in the ocean, senses that it's near a rock where other barnacles live, they like to live in groups, it glues its head to the rock and builds this cone-shaped fortress that you're seeing around here. And it's made out of limestone. And it has a trap door in what I call the ceiling. You see this trap door here? It's closed right now. And that's a really unique adaptation. And this glue that they attach themselves to rocks with is stronger than any glue that humans would use, stronger than anything that we've ever created, even Gorilla Glue. But this trap door opens during high tide so it can feed on microscopic plants and animals that float by. And they can survive by feeding for just a few hours per month when they are actually covered by high tides. So that's pretty cool. When it is low tide, when they're not covered by the ocean, they actually close this trapdoor known as an operculum because it traps water inside so they can survive and remain cool. Now, species that more people are familiar with are the harbor seals. And harbor seals are a much loved species at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. We have a ranger, a park ranger, his name is Rob Calla, who is a phenomenal photographer. And he took all of these pictures here. I think this one of the three heads on top of each other, that's one of my favorite photos ever. And this in the lower left corner is a harbor seal pup. So a newborn pup. And this beach right here is on Fitzgerald Marine Reserve property, and it is one of the few seal haul out beaches. So this beach, the seals will haul out en masse to warm themselves up, to give birth to their pups, to protect themselves from predators. So this is one of the few haul out beaches where they are safe. Harbor seals vary widely in color, and that causes a lot of people to get confused, thinking, are we looking at a lot of different species of seals or sea lions here? But harbor seals vary in color and pattern, and it's individual to that one seal. Just like our fingerprints are unique to us, all of the harbor seals have a completely different pattern and color to their fur. So these are all harbor seals, and you can see the variations in their colorations and their patterns there. Harbor seal mothers raise their pups in groups, and that's to protect the pups from predators. Now, in this area here, the predator that they are most prone to are sharks, particularly great white sharks. You've probably heard that we have quite a population of great white sharks off of the coast of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we definitely have them off of the coast of the Fitzgerald Marine Reserve here. It is actually pupping season right now. We're kind of in the tail end of pupping season. One of the beaches at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve is actually closed off right now because the harbor seal pups are all spending time on the beach nursing with their moms, and we want to protect them. So one of the main beach is actually closed right now, but Seal Cove Beach is open. And these pups, they're raised in groups, and within 5 minutes of being born, pups are capable of actually following their mom into the ocean, which is really neat. And during the first week of life, pups will often ride on their mom's back and then hop off a little bit to explore on their own before they get back on mom's back for protection. And a lot of people get confused about the difference between a harbor seal and a sea lion. They are two separate species. So if you take a look at this harbor seal pup here, you'll see you cannot see any ears. They do not have external ear flaps like you and I do, okay? They also tend to have very small front flippers. And so when they come up on shore, they kind of wiggle on their abdomen to move themselves up on the beach. And they do not have external ear flaps like you and I do. They tend to be a little bit quieter. Sea lions, on the other hand, the type that you're used to hearing about at Pier 39 in San Francisco, they're noisy. So they're the ones that bark, and they have much larger front flippers, and they use those flippers to kind of maneuver around a little bit more on land than seals are capable of doing. And California sea lions also tend to be pretty uniformly brown in color versus the harbor seals that have these different patterns. Okay, now we are going to move into the next zone, which is the high tide zone. So the high tide zone generally is exposed anywhere from 35 to 75% of the time. And you can see this picture down here. These are people who are out, they came out tide pooling, but there's not much exposed right now. And this is pretty typical. You can still see some animals in this zone here, but you're not going to see much. When it's low tide zone, you can walk all the way out here, as you can see with my mouse cursor, up to these rocks in the background here. This is a pretty detrimental zone because the waves are coming into this zone a lot. So the animals that live in this zone are often being pounded by some sort of wave action, and the rocks and the sticks that come with that wave action. They're also exposed to predators at low tide. So there's a lot of birds like great blue herons, black oyster catchers, and raccoons at nighttime that like to come out and kind of forage around for what can they pick out of this high tide zone for a quick little snack. So two of the most prominent species that you are going to see in this high tide zone are black turban snails and hermit crabs. So black turban snails are on the left here. And this is it's related to the snails that you might see in your very own backyard crawling around in your vegetable beds. Black turban snails, their shell is almost a deep purple to a black color. And the top of their shell, this very tip of their shell, often wears down to more of a tan or white color as they get exposed to waves and they kind of are hit against rocks with the wave action. So black turban snails can detach and roll away to escape if there's a predator nearby. And they move slowly around just like you would see other snails moving around on their muscular foot. They live in massive groups. They tend to stay kind of under rocks, and they can live 80 to 100 years, which is pretty impressive. The hermit crab on the right side really loves to take advantage of black turban snail shells. So when these shells are empty because the snail has died, the hermit crab will often move into one of these snail shells, which is really unique. And hermit crabs, unlike the crab that you're used to seeing like crawling around on the beach, they do not have a hard exoskeleton. Their abdomen is not covered by that hard exoskeleton. Rather, it has a thin, soft one. And I have a short video to play for you, and you'll actually get to see what their abdomen looks like. Their abdomens are actually kind of softer, and they twist so that they can fit into the shell that they're moving into. Hermit crabs constantly need, as they grow, they constantly have to find new shells to move into to accommodate their growing body. So let's watch this video. There's no sound, but just watch what it does as it's moving from its old shell to its new shell. And pay close attention coming up here. As it moves out, you can see its abdomen. See where it's white there and twisted, and see how it pops itself into that shell and actually twists its abdomen around to fit into that shell. And then it's moved completely into a new shell. And that's how it maneuvers itself around. And I think that's really, really a unique adaptation that they have. Okay, the next zone that we're moving into is called the mid-tide zone. So that is in this diagram over here. It's where the red plus signs are. So the mid-tide zone is covered by all high tides and uncovered by most low tides. So this is what the mid-tide zone typically looks like. This is at Seal Cove Beach, so you can see how far you can actually walk out onto these tide pools here. You can see this area is actually covered by this dense algae growth. So it tends to keep a lot of the animals that live in this zone cooler and covered. So they are not as exposed as you would be in the high tide zone. So we're going to go through, there's a lot of species that are found in this area. One of the most popular, of course, being sea anemones. And sea anemones, if you like Disney movies or Pixar movies, movies like Finding Nemo, definitely really popularized sea anemones and made them a very beloved animal. And we have a lot of different species of sea anemones that are found at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. So they are related to jellyfish and corals. And these species over here are actually called giant green anemones. And one really unique feature of the giant green anemone is it has an algae that lives inside of it. So you can kind of see this mossy green coloration that it has. And that's an algae. And this is a symbiotic relationship that the algae has with this anemone. So the algae supplies the anemone with food and oxygen, and the algae eats the anemone's waste. So that's a really unique adaptation that they have here. This over here, this brilliantly colored anemone, is called a painted anemone. And I really like this one up here. This anemone is totally closed. And you can see it almost looks like it has this beautiful pair of red lips, but it's not. It's because it's totally closed up, and that's just what is exposed. When anemones are uncovered, what they do is they often cover themselves in rocks and sand, as you can see this one doing here, because that helps to retain moisture and keep them cool during low tides. And they will also move all of their tentacles inside like this one did. And that's to retain moisture on the inside and keep cool. A lot of people, when they go out to the tide pools, they want to poke at them with their finger. And we always warn them not to do that, because when you poke at an anemone, what they do is they actually squirt water back at you, which can seem funny, but they're actually drying themselves out when they do that. So we try to remind kids, don't poke the anemones when you go to the tide pools. So anemones kind of have this fascinating life where they're pretty sedentary. Once they attach themselves to a spot on a rock, they very rarely move for the rest of their life. They will, unless needed, they will likely stay in that one spot, and they'll just open up. Their tentacles will come out during high tide. They'll grab food, and then they'll just revert inside when they are uncovered. They paralyze prey with the stinging cells that are found on the tips of their tentacles here. And then what they do, and I have a video to show you this, is they pull the prey inside into their oral cavity at the center, and that's where they actually digest everything. And then what they do is they spit out all the undigestible parts, like bones and shells. And a lot of people will see that surrounding the anemone as they're walking out. So let me show you this really unique video. So this is actually a video of a sea anemone eating a crab. And you can see when something was dropped, the tentacles come out and they grab onto the hermit crab and the snail, and they pull it all the way inside of them into their oral cavity that's in the middle. And then they'll eat that, and then they will spit out all the shells and all the bones that are not digestible. Okay. The next species we're going to talk about are one of the fishes that are found in this mid-tide zone. So this is a sculpin, and you can see how incredibly well camouflaged this fish is. It really blends in with this rocky environment. This is really the most common tide pool fish. We see them all the time at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve, but you really have to sit and stare at the tide pool for a long time before you can see one moving around, because they just camouflage so incredibly well. Sculpins, you can't really make it out in this picture, but they have extra large gills, like they're enormous. They take up most of their head. And that's because they're so commonly found in these little pools of water when the tides come and go, that they have to be able to extract as much oxygen from the seawater as possible. So that's why they have these extra large gills to prevent them from becoming oxygen depleted when they're in a tiny little pool. And then on the other side of the page here, we have mussels. And a lot of people are very familiar with mussel beds. And we have these all over Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. And this is what they look like. There's just hundreds, if not thousands, of mussels all together. And they look just ridiculous because it looks like, are these even alive? What do they do? What are they? And this is actually a real animal. And I have a video that will show you exactly what it is that they do. Mussels attach themselves to rocks by something called byssal threads. And these threads are produced in liquid form by the byssal gland. And when the liquid is exposed to seawater, it actually solidifies into this thread and it like tethers them to the rocks. When you actually go up to touch a mussel, they really don't move around at all because these byssal threads are so incredibly strong and tether them to that rock. So I'm going to show you a video of what a mussel looks like when it's actually feeding. There's no sound to this video either. So you'll see, this is when it's actually covered with seawater, they actually open up. So all of these mussels are going to open up and these little tiny parts come out of the mussel and you can see all of the plankton that was floating around up there, and they are trapped and caught by all these little threads and sucked into the inside of the mussel. And that's how they actually feed. So that's what they look like when they're actually covered with water, but you don't often see them in that environment. Sea stars. Sea stars are, of course, species that most of us affiliate when you think of not only the ocean, but also of tide pools. And we fortunately do have a few species of sea stars that are found at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. A lot of people commonly call them starfish, but they're actually not a fish. So that's why we technically call them sea stars. So sea stars do not have fins, they don't have scales, gills, or blood, and fish have all of those things, so they are not a fish. They are echinoderms, so they're related to sand dollars, those really cool things that a lot of people go looking for on the beach. They're related to sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Echinoderm means spiny skin. And you can definitely see on this ochre sea star down here how it has kind of more of a spiny skin. It's not spiny where it's going to hurt if you touch it, but it definitely is a little pokey. Most sea stars have 5 arms, as you can see this ochre sea star has. And this sea star up here also has 5 arms. But some species, like this one down here, the sunflower sea star, can have up to 24, sometimes even 40 arms, which is really cool. They have light sensitive eye spots on the tips of their arms here, and that helps them to find food. This is a bat star up here. And as I said, this is an ochre sea star down here. Ochre sea stars will actually eat mussels, which is what we just saw in the former slide. They actually pry them open with their tubular feet, and then they stick their stomach inside of the mussel to digest the inside, which is kind of gross, but that is how they eat. They eat by extending their stomach out through their mouth. Sunflower sea stars are a really unique, really phenomenal species of animal. Unfortunately, we no longer have sunflower sea stars at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. We have not seen them there since 2013. Back in 2013, there was a disease that came through called sunflower or sea star wasting disease. And we don't know if it was caused by an actual phenomenon like a virus that spread through sea stars, or if it was a warming ocean. Most likely it was a combination of both of them, but we saw massive wasting of sea stars all up and down the coastline from Washington state all the way down to California. And unfortunately, sunflower sea stars completely disappeared from the San Francisco Bay Area. So like I said, we haven't seen one there since 2013, whereas we used to see them pretty frequently. But they're this really unique animal because they have like about 24 arms in total. And I'm going to show you this video because it actually not only shows you the sunflower sea star, but it also shows you how sea stars move around. You can see how they're moving on all of their feet there. This is a species of snail moving around. And this crab is actually coming up to try to feed on the sunflower sea star. And a really unique feature of sea stars is that they can regenerate their legs. So that crab just took one of the arms of the sunflower sea star. It doesn't hurt the sea star, that leg can be regenerated, which is a really unique feature of them. Okay, another species that we see very frequently in the marine reserve are this animal called a chitin. And a lot of people are like, I've never heard of a chitin before. This is really unique. And when you look at them, they don't look like much. They look kind of just like a pretty rock. And these are all different species of chitin here. So up top here, we have a lined chitin, which I think is just beautiful with this rainbow-like pattern. This here is a gumboot chitin. To put this in perspective, this is larger than your foot. Gumboot chitins are enormous. And I led a tour at the Tidepools last week, and one of the students that we were showing around found a gumboot chitin. And I had actually never seen one up close and personal before. And it was really exciting to see. And it was just out of the water, just out of the tide pools. And it was significantly larger than my foot. That was really fun to see. And then this one down here is called the red chitin for obvious reasons. It's red. And this one here, I believe, is called the mossy green chitin. I'm going to show you a video of what they actually look like when they move. So chitins are typically identified by these 8 overlapping plates that they have on their back here. Gumboot chitins do not have that. They're kind of have a leathery covering to them. They kind of remind me of an armadillo in a sense. That's what I liken them to because of these overlapping plates that they have. But they're actually very flexible. So if they need to protect themselves and detach from a rock, they can actually detach themselves and kind of curl partway into a ball because these plates are flexible, and that is part of their defense mechanism. But what they will also do, very similar to the species that we met in the very beginning of the slideshow, the limpets, is they will also form a home scar. So they use these radula, these kind of sharp teeth, to form a home scar where they fit perfectly into. So as you're walking through the tide pools, you'll often see these shallow depressions, and they're perfectly formed and they're smooth. And you're like, what made that? And that is generally the home scar of a chitin. So they'll go out and feed, and then they will go back, just like the limpet, to this home scar. And that's where they will stay and protect themselves. They do move around, although they look like they wouldn't, but they do have a muscular foot that when they're covered with water, they kind of get up, detach themselves, and they cruise along the rocks on their muscular foot. They are found worldwide, but mainly in the tidal zones, mainly in tide pools, which is really unique. So let's take a look at this cute little creature cruising around. So, you know, it's not very exciting, but you can see in this video that they do actually move around. It's almost maybe like a pill bug or a sow bug that you see when you're walking around outside. So that is a chitin. And we see these pretty frequently at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. Algae. Algae is everywhere, of course, at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. It is extremely important. Not only do animals feed on it, but it also provides protection and coolness and cover for a lot of species of animals at Fitzgerald. All seaweed is algae. There's 3 kinds of algae: brown, green, and red. Giant kelp is a brown algae. So a lot of people are familiar with giant kelp, especially if you go down to the Monterey Bay area at all. Nori, which is the seaweed associated with sushi, is actually a red algae, which doesn't make sense, I know. The green color is actually from it being dried and roasted. So these are some of the more common seaweeds that we see. So you can see this kind of purplish color of seaweed in the middle here. We have a sea palm and then sea sacs. Sea sacks remind me of grapes. People like to pop them because they're nice and squishy and flexible. Last but not least, we have the low tide zone. So this is the zone that you actually don't get to see very often because it's only exposed about 7% of the time when the tide falls below zero. And as I said before, that really only happens in winter. And sometimes it's around like April to May when we start to see some other low tides. So right now we are having some good low tides. And this is what the tide pools look like. You can see how many people enjoy going out, especially on a low tide, because there is so much to see. So one of the species that you might get lucky enough to see at low tide, very low tide, is a nudibranch, also known as a sea slug. People love sea slugs. There are people that, this is their favorite animal. They'll dress like them for Halloween. People just adore them because they're actually really cute animals. So they are part of the sea slug family. They get their coloration. You can see these are 3 different species that we're looking at. So they get their coloration from the food that they eat, which is corals, sponges, anemones, and they are cannibalistic. They will eat other sea slugs. They have these adorable little, what's called rhinophores, little antenna on their head. And that's actually what picks up smells and helps them to find their food. They are found all over the world, most often in shallow tropical waters, which we definitely do not have tropical waters here, right? Our water here is freezing. So we do have just a few species that are found here. Mostly they like to be in the warm tropical waters. There are more than 3,000 species of nudibranchs found worldwide, which is a lot of nudibranchs. And they can be only 1/4 of an inch long, which is tiny, and they can be up to 12 inches long, so 1 foot long. I have only been with San Mateo County Parks for about 1.5 years, and I have only seen 1 nudibranch because it's hard to go out there at low tide. It doesn't happen very often, but I was lucky enough to see just 1 pretty far out, and it was absolutely beautiful. So if you've ever seen one, consider yourself lucky because they are hard to see. Other species that we do occasionally see at Fitzgerald are octopus. So this is the red octopus. I've never seen an octopus at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. I really would love to. Only a handful of people have seen them. Generally, you only see 1 during the course of your career. But the species that we do have are the red octopus. They can be deceiving though, because they camouflage so quickly because they're able to change their color to adapt and blend in with their surroundings so quickly that it's often pretty difficult to spot them. So you really have to be paying close attention. So this red octopus kills prey with venom secreted from its salivary glands, and then it cracks the shell open with its sharp beak. And what this octopus will do is it will actually deposit shells outside of its den in a pile. And this is often referred to as an octopus's garden. And it's so rare to see them. So if you see one, you are truly consider yourself lucky. Sea urchins, we actually have quite a few beds of sea urchins, but they're much further out. So only during the very lowest of tide will you actually see sea urchins. So sea urchin is an echinoderm related to the sea stars. And what happens is when sunflower sea stars are huge predators of sea urchins, but of course we don't have any more sunflower sea stars at Fitzgerald. So we are seeing an increase in the number of sea urchins because they don't have as many predators. Sea otters, the much beloved sea otter, is another huge predator of sea urchins, but we don't really have a lot of sea otters directly off of our coast of the San Mateo coast. You'll see an occasional sea otter, but it's not very common. You really have to go down to Monterey and Carmel to see plenty of them. So the sea urchin population is actually increasing because we don't have many predators up here. The problem with that is sea urchins eat kelp. That's their main food item. So when sea urchin populations increase, they tend to decimate the kelp forest, which is bad because a lot of animals depend on that kelp forest for food, shelter, and it also holds carbon dioxide from our atmosphere, which is great for carbon storage. We have a lot of unique birds at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. You can almost always see brown pelicans. Generally, they're just cruising by looking for food. Sometimes they like to rest on the beach. Black oyster catchers are probably one of my favorite species to see there. They're so cool because they have this black body and then this brilliant orange-red beak and eye. And they cruise around during low tide looking for all sorts of food to eat. And then, of course, we have lots of little shorebirds. These are a little group of sandpipers that we see pretty frequently. Fitzgerald Marine Reserve is in a marine protected area. So when it was opened, I believe in 1969, it was declared a reserve. And what that meant is you could no longer fish or collect items from Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. Back in the early 1900s, there was actually a restaurant on the beach at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. It was called the Reefs, and it was known for abalone. And the person who owned the restaurant stated he could go out and collect 50 abalone in a matter of half an hour. And that is definitely not the case anymore. I've seen abalone maybe a couple of times when I went out tide pooling. So you really cannot see that anymore. So the populations of the species have definitely changed over time, but this area is now completely protected. This is a drone shot that was taken by Park Ranger Rob, that excellent photographer. And I really appreciate this view because you can really see the entire reserve. So this over here is actually Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. The parking lot is right up here. So this is Moss Beach. Over here on the other side of the mountain here is Pacifica. This is the Devil Slide Trail up here. So this is Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. As you come through here, you can walk along the bluff trail through this forest of cypress trees here. And then this, this over here is Seal Cove Beach. So Seal Cove Beach, you can actually go tide pooling all out here. This is generally exposed by the low tides. So this is really a phenomenal area. And then our next park is right down here. It's called Pillar Point Bluff that goes out to, this is the Air Force Base down here with that. A lot of people call it the golf ball or the lollipop because it's some sort of a sonar station that's out there. So this is a really great view of all of this marine protected area. So this is a no-take area. You can't even collect shells or rocks because shells are used by animals like the hermit crab. That brings me to the end of my presentation. My email is up on this last page here, and I encourage all of you to visit our website as well. I hope all of you enjoyed the presentation and enjoyed visiting the tide pools with me today. And hopefully you have an opportunity to go out there and enjoy the tide pools. And even if you can't make it onto the tide pools themselves, you can look from the vantage points and there's beautiful views of the tide pools. You can often see all the harbor seals resting on the rocks there. So thank you all so much for listening today. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Tracy. This is wonderful. Very informative. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.